The scent of rust and coal hung in the air, mingling with the distant cry of a whistle. Riverbrook's train station stood still under the noonday sun, its chipped paint and wooden benches weathered like the minds of the people who lived there. But for Amara Wilson, that platform was supposed to be the threshold to a new life, a place of hope, not humiliation. She had worn her best. A powder blue dress with delicate stitching, matching gloves, and a wide-brimmed hat that had cost more than she could afford. Her suitcase bore the weight of more than clothes. It held everything she owned and everything she believed this journey might become. Love, freedom, a second chance. Then came the voice. "You're Amara Wilson?" The man looked confused, as if someone had swapped the photograph in his mind with a stranger. Harold Pierce's face went slack, color draining from his cheeks. He shifted from foot to foot like a man who had stepped into the wrong story. A bouquet of wilted daisies dangled from his hand like an afterthought. "This isn't going to work," he mumbled. Amara's smile faltered, the wind catching her hat's brim. "Excuse me? You didn't mention that you were—" He stopped, his throat clenched. "Black?" she said, finishing the sentence he didn't dare. His eyes darted around the station. People were watching. A colored woman standing tall and proud, a white man shrinking like paper in the rain. "I imagined something different from your letters," he stammered, sweat gathering on his brow. "You wrote so well. I thought you should have warned me." The slap of his words stung harder than if he'd raised a hand. Amara straightened her spine. "Warned you of what? That I'm a woman with dreams? That I traveled across the country believing your words were more than convenience? You have to understand," he muttered. "The town, the business, it wouldn't work. I spent my last savings to get here. I don't have a home to return to. I'll cover a hotel, enough for a few nights. Maybe you'll find work." Then, like a thunderclap against the soft murmur of shame, another voice cut in. "Is that your solution, Harold? Throw money at the dignity you just stumped on?" Both turned. A man stood tall at the edge of the platform. Sunlight etched the hard angles of his face, a weathered face that had seen storms, not just in the skies but in people. His clothes were simple, a linen shirt tucked into clean boots, no embellishment. But everything about him screamed power, quiet power, the kind that didn't ask for permission. "Alexander Maxwell," Harold muttered, suddenly looking like a child caught stealing. Alexander's eyes burned holes through him. 15 years I've known you, Harold, and I never realized you were this small." Turning to Amara, he removed his hat. "Miss Wilson, I own a property just outside town. There are rooms, space, and peace, if you'd accept a temporary stay while you find your feet." Harold gasped. "You can't be serious. What will people say?" "The same people who lease half their land from me?" Alexander smiled thinly. "I look forward to hearing their opinions." Amara studied him. His offer smelled nothing of pity, only decency. And yet she had learned to be suspicious of decency. Too often it came with strings. Still, the platform had become a stage of humiliation. There was nothing left to lose. She nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Maxwell." And just like that, she stepped off the platform, not just physically, but metaphorically, away from judgment, towards something uncertain but undeniably real. Behind her, Harold stood frozen, gripping useless flowers and fading. The road out of Riverbrook wound like a ribbon of dust, framed by gold-tinged fields and the distant silhouettes of willows bowing to the wind. Amara sat across from Alexander in the polished carriage, the tension still coiled in her chest like a spring that had been overwound. She clutched her gloves in her lap, their seams strained by the tightness of her grip. Alexander didn't speak at first. He let the silence breathe, not out of awkwardness, but respect. She wasn't ready. He knew it. Finally, he glanced at her with a calm voice, deep like a well. "If you're wondering whether I did that to make a scene, I didn't." Amara looked out the window. "You didn't have to do anything." "No, but I'm tired of watching decent people be treated like debris." She turned then, really turned, and studied him. Not his clothes or his stature, but his face. The weather-worn skin, the faint line across his jaw that looked like it had been made by shrapnel or something close to it. He wasn't just a farmer. He was something else entirely. A man who had chosen to live here, not one born of it. "I've never been treated like debris. I've been treated like dynamite, like something to fear." He didn't flinch. "Then it's high time they learned who taught you to explode." That almost made her smile. Almost. The gates of the Maxwell estate loomed ahead, not white picket but wrought iron twisted with the initials M.E., a crest she did not yet understand. Beyond them stretched an estate unlike anything Amara had expected. Fields, but also manicured gardens, rows of magnolia. A large Victorian house sat at the center, its slate roof catching the sun like silver. White columns held up a veranda large enough to host an orchestra. "This isn't a farmhouse," Amara muttered. "This is a kingdom." Alexander smiled faintly. "It's home, though I admit it's not humble." The carriage stopped. Before she could climb down, a woman emerged from the front door, middle-aged, stern-faced, but with a sharp kindness in her eyes. Her gray uniform and polished shoes marked her as staff, but her posture, that was military. "This is Mrs. Foster," Alexander said. "Housekeeper, cook, moral compass." Mrs. Foster extended a hand. "You'll be in the blue room, best view in the house." Amara hesitated but shook the hand. It was warm, firm, unapologetic. "I'll show you," the housekeeper said. "You look like someone who could use a hot bath and something strong." The morning sun spilled like liquid gold across the Maxwell estate, illuminating the carefully tended gardens, the distant stables, and the winding gravel paths that connected parts of the vast property. Birdsong drifted through open windows. Somewhere below, a horse whinnied softly. But within the manor walls, Amara Wilson stood barefoot on the cool wood floor of the library, frozen by what she saw. Books, thousands of them. The room stretched 2 stories high, with rolling ladders clinging to the upper shelves like silent sentinels. Sunlight streamed through tall arched windows, glinting off dust motes and leather-bound spines with gold filigree. It was more than a library. It was a cathedral of memory. She ran her fingers along the shelves, the familiar texture of worn bindings grounding her. Dante, Douglas, Darwin. But it wasn't the literature she sought. No, she was hunting ghosts. The kind that didn't rattle chains, but whispered through court records and buried transactions. That's when she found it, tucked behind a volume on 19th century farming legislation. Riverbrook Founding Charter, 1865 to 1875. Her breath hitched. She pulled it free and carried it to a table where a shaft of light waited. Opening the cover carefully, she scanned the brittle pages. Lists of land grants, names of families, transfers, modifications, and then a redacted section, inked over in clumsy haste. She frowned. Then she spotted something odd. In the margins, a note barely visible. C. J. Freeman, Appendix E. Her heart pounding. Amara dug deeper. That afternoon, Alexander found her still at the table, surrounded by papers, maps, and ink-stained fingers. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching her with quiet amusement. "I've seen less determination in courtroom prosecutors." Amara looked up. "You said the library was disorganized." "It is." "No, Mr. Maxwell," she said, tapping a weathered map. "This is edited." "Go on." She gestured to a spread of documents. "There's a 2-year gap in the founding records, 1870 to 1872. It's missing in every official document I found. But cross-referenced with land deeds from neighboring counties, you can trace an ownership transfer." "To who?" I met his eyes. "To Joseph Freeman." Alexander's brows lifted slightly. "That's a name the town pretends never existed." "My great-grandfather." Silence hung between them. "You're sure?" She nodded. "These aren't just stories. I have the original deed, signed by the governor of the state in 1866. Freeman was granted over 400 acres for his service and as reparations post-emancipation. And the land was taken, illegally, after he was nearly lynched and forced to flee." Alexander leaned forward, voice low. "Which land are we talking about?" She placed a transparent sheet over the map, a boundary overlay. It highlighted most of Riverbrook, including Harold Pierce's store. He sat back. "Good God! I think there was a committee formed in secret," she said, voice growing firmer, "to divide the land, to erase his claim. It's all here, if you know how to read between the lines." Alexander stared at her, something almost reverent in his gaze. "You came to marry a man who wrote poetry to you in letters, and instead you're preparing to shake the pillars of an entire town." "I came for freedom," she corrected. "Now I know what the price really is." The days that followed were tense, calculated, and strangely serene. While Amara spent her mornings buried in maps and archives, she took quiet walks in the orchard at dusk. Mrs. Foster began to set extra teacups at breakfast, as if preparing for a permanent guest. And the estate's workers, mostly black men and women who had once kept their eyes down, began to greet Amara with nods and smiles of recognition. Whispers had begun. She heard them in the distance, carried on wind and curiosity. "She's staying at the mansion. She's digging through the old records. She's not just a teacher, she's something more." And then, one afternoon, a familiar figure appeared at the gate. A storm had settled over Riverbrook, not of rain or thunder, but of whispers. In parlors and church halls, in grocery shops and post offices, tongues clacked with speculation and fear. The woman at Maxwell's, the one digging through papers, the one who turned Harold Pierce to ash with a sentence. But within the Maxwell estate, Amara Wilson worked in silence, a silence sharpened by purpose. The library had become her war room. Spread across the wide oak table were deeds, boundary maps, tax records, and handwritten letters scrawled by men who had once believed themselves untouchable. She traced timelines with red pencil, marked overlaps, identified forged signatures. Every page brought her closer to the truth. Riverbrook wasn't built on tradition, it was built on theft. Her great-grandfather, Joseph Freeman, a freedman and Civil War veteran, had been granted a vast swath of land in 1866. But between 1870 and 1872, a series of losses, a barn fire, a fabricated debt, and attempted lynching had forced him to flee. Days later, the land was conveniently redistributed among 5 families, including the Pierces. One name in particular stood out: Ezekiel Pierce, Harold's grandfather. The dots connected themselves. In the evenings, Amara would walk the estate grounds, letting the scent of honeysuckle and the chirp of crickets clear her mind. On one such evening, Alexander joined her. No suit, no boots polished to reflect power, just a man in shirt sleeves holding 2 glasses of chilled cider. "I know that look," he said, handing her a glass. "You've found something damning." She took a sip, then nodded. Everything. He didn't ask her to elaborate. He didn't need to. "You should know," she said softly, "that when this goes public, you won't just be harboring a librarian. You'll be accused of orchestrating a rebellion." Alexander chuckled. Good. I was beginning to worry I'd grown too complacent. They sat beneath a sycamore, and for a while neither spoke. Then Amara asked, "Why did you really offer me shelter that day?" He turned to her, eyes steady. "Because I saw a woman burning alive, and not a single soul in that station had the decency to reach for water." Amara's breath caught. He continued, "But now I see something else entirely." "What's that?" He smiled. "A woman holding a torch, and the rest of us praying not to get scorched." The next morning, she requested an audience with Judge Thornton. A man of brittle posture and sharp spectacles, Judge Thornton had presided over Riverbrook's civil affairs for nearly 30 years. He had known Joseph Freeman's name. Riverbrook's town hall had never hosted so many people. Not for harvest festivals, not for mayoral speeches, and certainly not for a black woman with papers. But on the appointed Thursday, the pew-like benches of the main chamber were full before the clock struck noon. Businessmen in vests, farmers in dust-stained coats, stern-faced women with tightly pinned buns. The founding families had come in force, not out of respect, but to defend what they believed was theirs. Whispers crawled like ivy across the walls. "She's bluffing. She's a northerner. She doesn't know our ways. She'll be gone by Sunday. God help us if she's right." At the front of the hall stood a row of polished wooden chairs. In one, Judge Thornton sat with a trembling jaw, trying not to sweat through his collar. Beside him, Reverend Miller clutched a worn Bible, knuckles white. And in the center, standing tall, was Harold Pierce, his face red, his hands restless. "He has no claim," he was saying, voice strained, "no education in legal matters, no stake in this town's blood or history. This entire circus is nothing but slander." Then the doors opened. Every head turned. Alexander Maxwell walked in first, composed, unreadable, a living monument to wealth that refused to kneel. Behind him came Amara. She wore navy again, but this time silk. Her hair was pinned back in a crown-like twist. A folder clutched to her side, and as she stepped into the room, the whispers stopped. Even hatred knew how to hold its breath when history walked in. Judge Thornton rose. "Miss Wilson, you requested this forum. The floor is yours." Amara's voice when she began was soft, but threaded with iron. "Ladies and gentlemen of Riverbrook, I stand before you not as a stranger, but as someone whose blood has roots deeper than most here care to admit." She opened the folder. "My name is Amara Wilson. I am a certified teacher. I hold legal power of attorney as the direct descendant of Joseph Freeman, a veteran of the Union Army, a freedman, and the legal owner of over 400 acres granted by the state of Louisiana in 1866. Gasps. Shifts in seats. A man in the back coughed violently. Harold stood. "That's absurd. Joseph Freeman is a myth, a tale passed around to stir resentment. There are no records." Amara pulled out a parchment, thick and yellowed with time. "This is the original land deed, signed by the governor, verified by the State Historical Records Commission." She passed it to the judge. He examined it, then nodded with grave finality. Harold's face twisted. "Forgery! Lies!" Amara didn't flinch. "Here are the tax receipts from 1866 through 1869, all in Joseph Freeman's name. And here," she pulled another document, "is the sworn affidavit of a land surveyor from 1871, filed after Freeman was forced to abandon his property due to escalating threats, including an attempted lynching. Eyes turned to the judge. He was pale now, reading, jaw clenched. Following his disappearance, 5 families formed the so-called Riverbrook Property Committee. Over the next year, they quietly divided the Freeman land, carving it into plots that became the cornerstones of their fortunes. Alexander stepped forward. My library contained copies of town land records. Curiously, the years 1870 to 1872 were missing until Riverbrook hadn't slept since the town hall eruption. By the next morning, the Freeman land deed was front-page news in 2 counties. Journalists trickled in like ants drawn to honey, whispering of scandal, of reckoning, of an educated black woman who had walked into a whitewashed town with nothing but a suitcase and set history on fire. But for Amara Wilson, the real work had only just begun. The Riverbrook Council met in emergency session. Behind closed doors, they argued for hours about precedents, about fear, about reputations too fragile to weather the truth. But the records were undeniable. Judge Thornton, despite his decades of political caution, had spoken clearly. This is not hearsay, it is restitution long overdue. Harold Pierce, however, was not done. While the council mulled over compromise, he waged a war of disinformation. He paid for pamphlets, planted editorials, whispered that Amara had forged everything, that Alexander was being seduced by a northern agitator, that the entire thing was a plot to seize land and wealth under the guise of historical justice. One afternoon, as Amara walked the village street for the first time since her arrival, she passed a woman who muttered just loud enough to hear, "They always want something for nothing." Amara turned, met her eyes, and smiled coolly. "I already had everything. I just came to remind you it was mine." Inside the Maxwell estate, preparations were underway. Alexander had summoned a legal team, real professionals from Baton Rouge and New Orleans, and gave them full access to the Maxwell Library. Together with Amara, they compiled a legal dossier thicker than any Bible in Riverbrook's chapels. Mrs. Foster began preparing guest rooms for visiting scholars. She didn't say much, but one night as she brought Amara a tray of tea, she lingered. "You're doing something big," she said, not asking, just stating. Amara looked up from her work. "Something overdue." The older woman nodded. "Good. Just don't let them turn you into what they fear." "They already did that the moment I stepped off the train." 1 week later, the Riverbrook Council reconvened, but this time the chamber was packed with outsiders. State officials, legal observers, a lawyer from the State Historical Records Commission who had personally examined Amara's documents stepped to the podium. "These materials are authentic. The deed to Joseph Freeman predates any existing Riverbrook property record by 2 years. The evidence of fraudulent transfer is clear." Then, unexpectedly, the door opened, and in walked attorney Jeff Langston. Amara's heart jumped. He wasn't just any lawyer. He was known across 3 states for civil justice litigation. Jeff nodded at Amara, then addressed the council. "I have filed a formal suit on behalf of the Freeman descendants. The defendants include the Riverbrook Property Committee, historical and present, and any properties still legally benefiting from the disputed transfer. We are seeking recognition, restitution, and a court-supervised resolution." The room broke into chaos. Shouts, outrage, chairs scraping, and Harold Pierce, pale as milk, gripping. 6 months had passed since the Freeman revelation shattered the illusion of Riverbrook's unblemished legacy. In that time, something extraordinary had happened. Not a revolution, not a riot, but a reckoning. The wounds had not healed completely. Some never would. But where there was once denial, now there was dialogue. And where there was once shame, now there was the beginning of pride. Not for what had been, but for what could be. And at the center of that transformation stood Amara Wilson. The Freeman Foundation had already issued its first 10 scholarships. Children who once walked past closed gates were now enrolling in schools their ancestors had helped to fund without even knowing it. The Freeman Maxwell Community Center, a repurposed wing of Alexander's estate, opened its doors to the public with a full library, a language lab, and evening classes taught by volunteers. Mrs. Foster ran the center's schedule like a general with a clipboard. "I've waited 30 years to see these gardens filled with the right kind of noise," she said one afternoon, watching children tumble through the grass once reserved for luncheons and gala picnics. Amara smiled. "What kind of noise is that?" "Laughter without permission." Alexander, meanwhile, had quietly stepped back, letting Amara take the spotlight, the credit, the future. But he was never far. At town meetings, she'd find him in the back, arms folded, a ghost of a smile whenever she spoke with fire. At dinner, they'd discuss zoning laws and historical archives like others might discuss poetry. And in those moments, when the tea had cooled and the lamps burned low, his hand would occasionally find hers. No declaration, just presence. They were not yet lovers, but they were more than allies. On the first day of fall, Judge Thornton hosted a public ceremony in the newly refurbished town square. Gone were the Confederate banners that once hung like ancient threats. In their place, murals, stories, and faces previously erased from Riverbrook's collective memory. And at the center, a modest structure, not a grand statue, but a bronze plaque embedded in the square itself, engraved in both block letters and elegant script. In honor of Joseph Freeman, whose land built a town, whose name built a legacy, and whose descendant rewrote the ending with grace. The crowd was silent for a long moment, then a single clap, then another, until the square rang with applause that echoed off the brick and glass. Harold Pierce was not in attendance, but his absence, too, was a statement, one that faded in significance as the town's children lined up to place flowers beneath the plaque. That evening, back on the porch of the Maxwell estate, now shared equally in name and deed, Amara sipped tea. The porch light glowed warm against the twilight, casting soft halos on the wooden floorboards where Amara stood barefoot, arms crossed loosely as she watched the last children disappear beyond the gates. The cultural center's evening choir practice had just ended, and their laughter lingered in the wind like a hymn of defiance and rebirth. From a distance, Riverbrook looked the same. Winding roads, white houses, churches with bell towers that kissed the sky. But beneath its polished surface, something profound had shifted. It no longer belonged to just the families who had named its streets. It belonged to everyone. Inside, the fire crackled low. Alexander poured 2 cups of chamomile tea, adding a splash of honey to hers without asking. He'd learned her rituals the way a pianist learns a familiar key, slowly, respectfully, reverently. He handed her a cup and joined her on the swing, the old wood creaking under the weight of something that had taken months to find its rhythm, belonging. "You never did answer," he said. "Answer what?" "When I asked, 'Why me?'" Amara looked at him. "Why did you trust me when you had every reason not to?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because you didn't flinch." "Flinch?" "When I said black, when I said Joseph Freeman, when I said I wasn't going back." She turned toward him, her eyes warm but sharp. Alexander leaned back. "Maybe I was too stunned." "Maybe," she said, sipping, "but even stunned, you chose to stand beside me." He nodded. "I still do." A soft knock at the door pulled them both from the moment. Mrs. Foster peeked through, holding a thick manila envelope. "Mail, from Baton Rouge." Amara took it carefully, her name typed neatly on the front. Inside, a certificate. Joseph Freeman's land deed, officially updated, amended, notarized, and archived in the state register. The accompanying letter was brief. Miss Wilson, on behalf of the Historical Records Commission and the Office of Land Preservation, we acknowledge your successful petition to correct one of the most significant historical omissions in the region's records. Your great-grandfather's name now stands where it always should have been. With deep respect, Attorney General L. Gardner. She held it with both hands, not like paper, but like a torch. Later that night, as they walked the garden paths, Amara paused beside a plaque newly embedded in the path. The Freeman Maxwell Trust Garden, established to honor truth, equity, and shared legacy. She turned to Alexander. "Did you ever imagine this?" He smiled. "No, but I hoped." They stood in silence, watching the moon rise over land once lost and now reclaimed, not through war, but through wisdom. And Amara thought about all the things she had written in those early letters to Harold Pierce, the ones filled with longing, with carefully chosen words, with dreams small enough to be accepted. She had arrived in Riverbrook hoping to marry a man who wanted a quiet life. She had stayed to build a future no man could have imagined.